Now that we're entering upon the all-new 12-team college football playoff, it's time to revisit the entire history of the 4-team college football playoff. We start our journey in 2011. I have a video that goes over the entire BCS and the events that led to its downfall, but what really put the nail in the coffin in the BCS was when LSU rematched Alabama in the BCS National Championship game. For the first time ever, two teams from one conference would meet in a BCS National Championship, and these two teams might have been the best two in the country, but that didn't matter because they had already played when LSU won the game of the century 9-6 in Tuscaloosa, and that game was rendered meaningless when Alabama was granted a rematch. It was only a matter of time before this happened though. We just narrowly missed out on a Michigan-Ohio State rematch in 2006, and now with the SEC's dominance in college football, an all-SEC national championship was only a given. So now, thanks to the fan outcry after the 21-0 win for Alabama against LSU in the BCS title, the pressure was up to give us a playoff. Discussion had already begun in 2011 because the BCS contract was coming to an end at the end of the 2013 season. But with the way fans have felt not just now but for over a decade about the BCS, there was no way to justify it coming back. That leads us to 2012. The commissioners and president spent countless hours evaluating the many possible formats. These included returning to the old bowl system with no attempt to match the top two seeds, to continuing the BCS, to creating a multi-team tournament. The commissioners affirmed a commitment to protect college football's regular season, the best in sports, and to preserve the bowl tradition and the bowl experience for student athletes. Further, they focused on the realities of the academic calendar and the options related to where the game should be played. They self-imposed a deadline of the summer of 2012 to decide what changes to propose to the presidents. Then on April 25, 2012, the commissioners took both an 8-team and 16-team playoff off the table. They prepared a small number of 4-team options for discussion in the conference meetings to be held in May. They discussed in detail the advantages and disadvantages of various ways to rank or qualify teams. Next in the process was establishing the rules. So just 6 days later, they'd all have another meeting, this time in Washington, D.C., where members unanimously voted to propose legislation to the NCAA for a new postseason format, eventually leading to the college football playoff. Presidents approved recommendations by commissioners on June 20th, with the NCAA finalizing the proposal in August. The key policies endorsed were first, rotating playoff semifinals among 6 bowl sites and hosting the national championship at a neutral location. Second, forming a selection committee to rank teams based on criteria of win-loss record, strength of schedule, head-to-head results, and conference championships. Third, scheduling playoff semifinals on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. Fourth, establishing Championship Monday with the national championship game on the first Monday in January at least 6 days after the semifinals. Fifth, implementing the new format for a 12-year term 2014-15 to 2025-26. And it'd be ESPN who secured the exclusive rights to present the playoff games across its platform for the 12 years. And lastly, we'd find out the 6-game rotation for the college football playoff semifinals. The Rose and Sugar had been chosen months ago to host the inaugural semifinal games. Obviously, the Orange Bowl was next in line as they had also been in the BCS rotation, followed by the Fiesta Bowl. So the 2 remaining bowls to be chosen were the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl and the Goodyear Cotton Bowl, which will round out the New Year's 6. Some final things to be squared away was establishing the selection committee, which will be comprised of up to 18 members with 3-year terms. Members were classified into 5 groups: athletic directors, former coaches, student athletes, administrators, and journalists. It excluded individuals actively working for media agencies or serving as commentators. 5 slots were reserved for athletic directors from the ACC, Big 10, Big 12, SEC, and Pac-12, and the members were selected by unanimous consent of the management committee, with no honoraria provided. The first selection committee members were announced on October 16, 2013. Those members included notable figures like Barry Alvarez, Oliver Luck, Condoleezza Rice, and Archie Manning. And it'd be chaired by Jeff Long, Arkansas's athletic director. And they'd meet to announce the rankings compiled 7 times during the season, including on Selection Sunday. The rankings were announced on Tuesday evening starting on October 28th, and there'd be a recusal policy and voting procedures established to ensure fairness. They addressed the BCS's criticisms by replacing the controversial computer-based and poll-based selection with the Human Committee for Transparency and Fairness. A lot, I know. But now it was time for the 2014 college football season, the first season of the college football playoff. And in this video, we're going to go over every single weekly college football playoff ranking from October to December in all 10 years of the 4-team college football playoff. So get your favorite snack, get your popcorn, whatever you eat when watching a movie, because this is going to be a wild ride full of upsets, monopolies, disappointment, and even lawsuits. Florida State was of course the preseason #1 with the returning Jameis Winston coming off their BCS National Championship victory of Auburn in the Rose Bowl. #2 was Alabama, who had just narrowly missed out on facing Florida State in the BCS Championship thanks to Chris Davis in the Iron Bowl. Third was Oregon, poised for their first national championship with Marcus Mariota reaching his peak form. And fourth, we have Oklahoma, the team who had just beaten Alabama in the Sugar Bowl last New Year's. The rest of the top 10 seeds Ohio State, Auburn, UCLA, defending Rose Bowl champs Michigan State, South Carolina, and Baylor. Fast forwarding to October 28th, we'd see Mississippi State ranked #1 in the first ever college football playoff rankings. This Mississippi State team had of course Dak Prescott, and he led them to major wins over 8th ranked LSU in Death Valley on September 20th, 6th ranked Texas A&M on October 10th, and 2nd ranked defending SEC champion Auburn on October 11th. A very impressive resume that was the undisputed best in the country, defeating 3 top 10 SEC teams in consecutive weeks. At 2, we see Florida State, and I've mentioned before in videos that this Florida State team would barely scathe past their opponents, but they do just enough to stay top 4. At 3rd, we have Auburn, so even with the loss to Mississippi State, they'd still have a top 3 ranking. And then coming in at 4th was Ole Miss, who had a stunning 23-17 victory over Alabama on October 4th. The first 2 out were Oregon at 5 and Alabama at 6. The first major shakeup in the rankings came the next week on November 4th, when Ole Miss was dropped from 4th to 11th following their defeat to 24th ranked LSU on October 25th. Then the next week, Auburn would follow the same trend and be dropped from 3rd to 9th after losing to a now unranked Texas A&M team. Also in this time span, Oregon jumped Florida State, and Alabama would find themselves at 5th, right outside the top 4, with the perfect opportunity not to just jump into the top 4, but to take the top spot in a major battle with #1 Mississippi State. And it was a close battle, but Alabama edged out a 25-20 win in Tuscaloosa to claim their first ever #1 college football playoff seed and become the second team to ever be ranked #1 in the playoff CFP rankings. And there was just 3 games to go from this point on. Now on November 18th, Alabama was #1, Oregon had a stronghold on the 2 seed, Florida State was 3rd, and Mississippi State stayed in the top 4 at #4. And then the first 2 out, TCU was 5th, and now Ohio State had bounced back from their loss to Virginia Tech and were ranked 6th after being ranked 16th in the inaugural college football playoff rankings. On November 25th, the major rankings stayed the exact same, but December 2nd on the penultimate college football playoff rankings, major changes took place. Gone was Mississippi State, who suffered their second loss in 3 weeks, falling to 19th ranked Ole Miss in the final game of the regular season. The 1 and 2 of Alabama and Oregon stayed the same, but now TCU would jump into the 3rd spot, pushing down Florida State, who was on life number 50 it seemed. And at the very important first team out, we saw Ohio State. Now let's set the stage for Championship Saturday. The Big Ten Championship would see Ohio State without their QB1, who was injured in the preseason, and now without their QB2, who broke his ankle against Michigan. So now the keys were handed to Cardale Jones, who would need some dominoes before him to fall, and then a dominant performance versus Wisconsin and Indianapolis. Then we have TCU. They, just like Ohio State, had 1 loss on the year, which was a 3-point loss to the 5th ranked Baylor Bears, who also had just 1 loss and was right outside the playoff. But this was a time period where there was no Big 12 championship game, so TCU didn't have another chance to prove themselves versus a top ranked team, unlike Ohio State, who would be facing a top 15 team. And Baylor would need a lot of things to fall their way to make it in. So the Big 12 just named TCU and Baylor co-Big 12 champions. The SEC of course would see Alabama in the title game, and they'd be matched up with Missouri. In the Pac-12, Oregon would be playing top 10 Arizona, and then in the ACC Championship, Florida State would have one last bullet to dodge en route to the playoff, 11th ranked Georgia Tech. Let's get Alabama out the way. They dominated Missouri 42-13 to lock up the 1 seed. And then in an even more dominant fashion, Oregon would beat Arizona 51-13 to win the Pac-12. So the first 2 spots were locked up. Spots 3 and 4 would be where the drama takes place. In the ACC, Florida State with another Houdini act escaped Georgia Tech 37-35 to win the ACC and pretty much lock up a playoff spot with an unblemished resume. So now it was between the 2 one-loss teams fighting for the final playoff spot, TCU and Ohio State, with of course Baylor saying, "What about me too?" Now TCU wasn't exactly sitting at home on Championship Saturday. They had a regular season matchup against an unranked Iowa State team, which they won in convincing fashion 55-3. And Baylor, who also had a game, beat 9th ranked Kansas State 38-27. But Ohio State had the most dominant performance of the three behind the arm of Cardale Jones, who threw 3 touchdowns in the 59-0 win over the 13th ranked team in the country. Not to mention Ezekiel Elliott would rush for 220 yards and 2 touchdowns. You can do the math here. Ohio State won a conference championship, shutting out a top 15 team. Meanwhile, TCU won a final regular season game against a 2-win team. And Baylor, who also did not win a conference championship game, still had their loss to West Virginia looming large. It was pretty obvious that as long as Ohio State looked good, they'd get the final spot. And with the wins of Alabama, Oregon, and Florida State, TCU was sitting on the outside looking in. Selection Sunday saw SEC champ Alabama at 1, Pac-12 champ Oregon at 2, ACC champ Florida State at 3, and Big Ten champ Ohio State at 4. Just on the outside would be both of the co-Big 12 champs, with Baylor actually jumping TCU for the 5th spot after their 38-27 win over 9th ranked Kansas State and TCU at 6. A heartbreaker for the Big 12 to have not one, but 2 teams filling the first 2 teams out, and that's just a reward for not playing a conference championship game. But to fall from 3 in the penultimate rankings to 6 in the final rankings after doing nothing wrong and even winning in a convincing fashion did seem a little unfair. But now that we have the rankings squared away, it'd be time to reveal who was headed where. The 1 was playing the 4, so Alabama chose to play closer to home for their matchup with the Buckeyes in the Sugar Bowl, which also has SEC ties. And then the 2nd seed Oregon would be very happy being left with the Rose Bowl game for their 2-3 matchup with Florida State, who would now have to travel across the entire country. And the first ever college football playoff game would be the Rose Bowl game. Fitting, some of the best national championships ever took place in this stadium. Games like Texas vs USC, and even the year before in this very same stadium when Florida State staged a comeback against Auburn. It's a miracle they're even in this game with the amount of escape acts they had to pull off. Florida State might have had 50 lives this season, but life number 51 was not in the inventory. And thanks to a strong second half, Oregon would run away with a commanding 59-20 win. So one half of the national championship was set. Now it seemed Alabama was heading to Arlington, but Cardale Jones, Ezekiel Elliott, and Michael Thomas had other thoughts. And Zeke would run 85 yards to the heart of the South to send Ohio State to the national championship, upsetting number 1 Alabama 42-35. Even though the Rose Bowl wasn't close, both of these games were very entertaining, and now we have a highly anticipated rematch of the 2010 Rose Bowl game between Oregon and Ohio State, which ended up becoming the most watched non-national title BCS game of all time. Ohio State won on that day, but since then Oregon had actually made a trip to the BCS National Championship in the 2010 season where they lost to Cam Newton and Auburn in Arizona. And the Buckeyes in the 2012 season put up an undefeated season but weren't bowl eligible due to NCAA sanctions. So now both teams were looking to avenge their shortcomings. Mariota was looking to cap off his Heisman season with a national championship, and Cardale Jones was looking to do the unthinkable and lead Ohio State to the national championship after they lost their top 2 quarterbacks. And that he'd do thanks to yet another monster game from Ezekiel Elliott. Ohio State, who we didn't even know if they'd make the playoff heading into Selection Sunday, had upset the number 1 and number 2 teams en route to the first ever college football playoff national championship. This result basically confirmed everyone's opinion who had wanted a playoff for decades, because under no circumstances would Ohio State have had a shot at the national title in the BCS, but thanks to the playoff they got their chance and they ran with it. The future of the playoff seemed bright, but I will say this was probably the peak of the playoff when it comes to entertainment and games. For the most part, the semi-final games after this weren't even close, and there would be 2 clear teams who dominate in this format from now on: Clemson and Alabama. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, please subscribe to the channel, as less than 3% of you guys who watch the videos are subscribed to the channel. So for more videos like this, please subscribe and recruit a friend to subscribe here too. We've now made it to 2015, also known as Year 2. The semifinals will now be the Capital One Orange Bowl and the Goodyear Cotton Bowl. In the preseason, defending champion Ohio State will be ranked number 1, and they'd be returning literally everybody from the championship team. They received every single first place vote from the AP. Behind them was TCU at 2, Alabama at 3, and Baylor at 4. So right away we see those 2 Big 12 teams who just missed the playoff are ranked inside the top 4. The rest of the top 10 saw Michigan State, Auburn, Oregon, USC, Georgia, and Florida State. It's also important to note Clemson is at 12 currently. By the time we did get to the first rankings on November 3rd, oh did things change. The new number 1 was now Clemson, who led by Deshaun Watson didn't play a schedule close to what Mississippi State did in 2014 up to this point, playing only one ranked team, being a 24-22 win versus Notre Dame. At 2 was LSU, who had climbed from 14 in the preseason to get to this point. They had 3 top 25 wins, being wins over 25th ranked Mississippi State, 18th ranked Auburn, and 8th ranked Florida. 3rd was Ohio State, who avenged their previous season's loss to Virginia Tech in Week 1, but still had 0 top 25 matchups, causing their slide in the rankings. 4th was Alabama, who yet again had lost to Ole Miss. This time a 43-37 loss for their 2nd straight loss to the Rebels, but they bounced back with wins over 8th ranked Georgia and 9th ranked Texas A&M. Notre Dame was 5, followed by Baylor, Michigan State, and TCU to round out the top 8. But we were guaranteed to see a major shift in the rankings when on November 7th, the LSU Tigers were coming to Tuscaloosa for a massive top 4 matchup. And this game was going to essentially decide the Heisman Trophy winner. It was either going to be LSU's Leonard Fournette or Alabama's Derrick Henry. And Derrick Henry snatched the Heisman away convincingly. Leonard Fournette ran for a grand total of 31 yards. Meanwhile, his counterpart Henry ran for 210 yards and 3 touchdowns. Alabama won the game 30-16 and took the number 2 spot as the Tigers fell from 2 to 9. The other Tigers in Clemson, South Carolina stayed at 1, Ohio State stayed at 3, and Notre Dame moved up into the top 4 at 4. And now Iowa would move from the 9th spot into the 5 spot, and Baylor stayed at 6. The next week's rankings would see the top 5 stay identical. Oklahoma State had moved up to 6 after Baylor fell to Oklahoma. Those Oklahoma Sooners were now 7th. The Florida Gators were 8th, and LSU fell from 9 to 15 after their 2nd loss in a row, this time losing to an unranked Arkansas team 31-14. Oh, and just to get a head start, LSU would fall completely out of the top 25 with their 3rd straight loss, this time 38-17 to Ole Miss. Yet again, 1 and 2 would stay put as major changes took place in the rest of the top 4. Number 3 Ohio State would face their 1st ranked team all year in number 9 Michigan State. And on a rainy night in Columbus, the unbeaten Buckeyes fell to the Spartans 17-14 at the buzzer. Ohio State now didn't control their destiny to the Big Ten title game and were basically out. At 3, Oklahoma now staked their claim for a playoff spot after back-to-back top 25 wins behind the arm of Baker Mayfield, taking down 6th ranked Baylor and 18th ranked TCU. At 4, Notre Dame would fall after a close win versus Boston College. Iowa would be the ones to jump up and take their spot. And then to round it out, MSU would jump to 5 after their win in the Horseshoe, and they'd be trailed by Notre Dame at 6. The penultimate December 1st rankings saw the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 rankings stay the same. The 6th spot would now go to Ohio State, which was pretty much irrelevant unless a miracle took place because either Iowa or Michigan State was pretty much locked into the 4th spot. And then Stanford slid into the 7th spot while Notre Dame was at 8, where they were placed last week after their loss to Stanford. Championship Saturday saw Alabama and Florida in the SEC Championship, Clemson and North Carolina in the ACC Championship, Michigan State and Iowa in the Big Ten Championship, and Stanford and USC in the Pac-12 Championship. Number 1 Clemson took care of business in a 45-37 win versus top 10 North Carolina. Number 2 Alabama easily beat 18th ranked Florida 29-15, confirming that the Heisman would be heading to Derrick Henry's trophy case. Number 3 Oklahoma didn't have a conference title because again the Big 12 rules, but their regular season schedule of wins over 23rd West Virginia earlier in the season and 3 straight top 25 wins and wins over 6th ranked Baylor, 18th TCU, and 11th Oklahoma State locked up their playoff spot. So there was only one game left to decide who'd be going to the playoff. Either Iowa or Michigan State would punch their first playoff trip with everything on the line. And in a grinded out war, Michigan State would deliver the knockout punch, scoring from a yard out with 27 seconds to go to take a 16-13 lead. MSU had claimed the final playoff spot, which would really be 3rd since Oklahoma was being dropped to 4th for not playing in a conference championship. The final CFP ranking saw a top 6 of ACC champ Clemson, SEC champ Alabama, Big Ten champ Michigan State, Big 12 champ Oklahoma, and the Big Ten Conference runner-up Iowa, followed by the Pac-12 champion Stanford. This would leave us with number 1 Clemson and number 4 Oklahoma in the Orange Bowl, and number 2 Alabama versus number 3 Michigan State in the Cotton Bowl. And remember when I said after the 2014 playoffs that for the most part the semifinal games after it weren't close and there would be 2 clear teams who dominate in this format from now on, being Clemson and Alabama? Well, yeah, that statement seems like an understatement because both of these games were blowouts. In the Orange Bowl, Clemson leveled Oklahoma 37-17 to go to the national championship. And then at night, Alabama went on to shut out Michigan State 38-0 to punch their ticket to Arizona. And this would be the start of the trend for the playoff semifinal games. But on to the national championship game. Clemson and Alabama would more than make up for the lackluster semifinal games. Alabama, led by Florida State transfer Jake Coker and running back Derrick Henry, would outduel Deshaun Watson and Clemson 45-40 to win Saban's first college football playoff national championship. And in 2016, Alabama would be looking to repeat as national champion. This time the semifinal games would be in the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl and the PlayStation Fiesta Bowl. And those games would decide who'd head to Tampa, Florida to compete for a national champion. Of course, defending champion Alabama would open up the preseason ranked number 1 with the team they beat in the national championship, Clemson, at 2. At 3, we'd see Oklahoma, who had lost to Clemson in the previous playoff, and then Florida State made their way back into the preseason top 4. The rest of the top 10 would see LSU, Ohio State, Michigan, Stanford, Tennessee, and Notre Dame. And the first playoff rankings on November 1st saw Alabama at 1, who put up a very impressive schedule, beating number 20 USC in the season opener in Arlington 52-6, 19th Ole Miss 48-43, and if you guys remember, Ole Miss gave them problems the last 2 years. They then beat 3 straight top 25 teams leading into the first rankings in number 16 Arkansas 49-30, 9th ranked Tennessee 49-10, and then 6th ranked Texas A&M 33-14. Bama was the clear number 1, and they still had 13th ranked LSU on November 5th in Death Valley. Sitting at 2 was Clemson, who faced one top 25 team in number 3 Louisville. And that was the insane Watson vs Lamar game where Clemson prevailed 42-36 to jump back into the top 4. At 3 was Michigan, who just like Clemson faced just one top 25 team in 8th ranked Wisconsin, where they won 14-7. But we all knew their season would come down to their date in Columbus with the Buckeyes. And to round out the top 4 was Texas A&M, who had a very impressive resume, beating top 25 UCLA, Arkansas, and Tennessee teams before their 33-14 loss to number 1 Alabama. Washington with their John Ross team would be at 5, and Ohio State was at 6 after the Penn State loss in the first 2 out. Louisville, as mentioned earlier, who had the 1 loss to Clemson, was at 7. And going into the second week's rankings, the top 3 stayed put, but Texas A&M would fall from 4 to 8 after their 35-28 loss to an unranked Mississippi State team. And just a heads up, they'd be out the top 25 come 2 weeks. This would lead to Washington sliding into the top 4 and Ohio State up to 5, followed by Louisville at 6. The third week of rankings saw major shifts outside of Alabama, who stayed put at number 1. Clemson fell 2 spots to 4 after their 1.43-42 loss to an unranked Pitt. But Michigan couldn't capitalize as Ohio State beat top 10 Nebraska 62-3 to jump to that 2nd spot. So Michigan stayed put at 3, and Washington fell from 4 to 6 in result of their 26-13 loss to 20th ranked USC. And that means Louisville was the new number 5. Thankfully, the November 22nd rankings would lower the temperature with 1, 2, 3, and 4 staying the same. The major change of the week was 5th ranked Louisville falling to 11 after their 36-10 loss to Houston. As a result, Washington slid up to 5 and Wisconsin was 6. But coming up was the game. Number 2 Ohio State facing number 3 Michigan in the Horseshoe in a win-and-in for a ticket to the college football playoff. And in a thrilling old-school defensive battle, the Buckeyes prevailed in overtime with a 30-27 win. And even though Ohio State beat Michigan to finish 11-1, they did not get a date in the Big Ten title game because of their lone loss to Penn State, who had the tiebreaker despite being the lower-ranked team. The rest of conference championship weekend saw yet again Alabama taking the field in Atlanta, this time renewing an old rivalry versus Florida where the Tide walked away winning 54-16. The ACC championship saw Clemson hold off a Virginia Tech comeback to win 42-25, and the Big Ten championship saw number 7 Penn State take down number 6 Wisconsin 38-31. And lastly, in the Pac-12 championship, Washington throttled 8th ranked Colorado to secure their playoff spot. So on Selection Sunday, the 1 and 2 were obvious. Alabama was 1 and Clemson was 2. Ohio State of course fell because they didn't make their title game, but they still secured a top 3 spot. And that means Washington would be slotted at 4. The first 2 out was Big Ten champion Penn State at 5, and the loser of the game, Michigan, at 6. This would send number 1 Alabama and number 4 Washington to the Peach Bowl in Atlanta, and number 2 Clemson and number 3 Ohio State to the Fiesta Bowl in Glendale. And just like last year, we'd see 2 blowouts to set up a Clemson-Alabama national championship. Alabama dispatched of Washington 24-7, and I remember the whole time just waiting for anything exciting to happen. But Washington just never got anything going. This would also be the final Peach Bowl in the Georgia Dome. And at night, Clemson just had their way with Ohio State. Yet again, we saw a shutout in a semifinal, and this also is the second year in a row the BCS would have given us the better alternative, because just like Cavs Warriors in 2015, 16, and 17, it didn't matter how we got to this championship matchup because it was always inevitable. And thankfully, yet again, Clemson and Alabama delivered on an all-time classic in the national championship to make up for the lackluster semifinals. This time, Watson and the Tigers would get their revenge on Alabama in the very final seconds when Watson found Renfro in the end zone with just 1 second to go to deny Saban another repeat and win 35-31. And just like that, we're on year 3. The playoff semifinals were back to where it all began. The Rose Bowl game presented by Northwestern Mutual and the All-State Sugar Bowl. All for the right to go to Atlanta for the national title game. And you already know who'd be number 1, Alabama. At 2 was Ohio State, 3 was Florida State, and 4 was USC. And all the way down to 5 was Clemson in their first year without Deshaun Watson. The last 5 of the top 10 was Penn State, Oklahoma, Washington, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma State. And on October 31st for the first CFP rankings, we'd see Georgia get the number 1 seed. Georgia had a win over 24th ranked Notre Dame 20-19 in South Bend. And that Notre Dame team was now ranked 3rd in the first CFP rankings. Of course, 2nd would be Alabama and 4th would yet again be Clemson. The November 2nd rankings will give us the exact same top 5 of Georgia, Alabama, Notre Dame, Clemson, and Oklahoma. But at number 6, Ohio State would fall all the way to 13 after losing to unranked Iowa 55-24. This was their second loss because they had lost to the, at the time, 5th ranked Oklahoma Sooners 31-16 at home where Baker Mayfield planted the flag. And at 7 was Miami, who was putting up an undefeated season that just saw them take down 13th ranked Virginia Tech 28-10. The next week's rankings saw Georgia fall to 10th ranked Auburn 40-17, which gave Alabama the number 1 seed yet again in this video. And then all of a sudden, Miami would jump 4 spots to 3rd after a very impressive 41-8 win over 3rd ranked Notre Dame. Clemson by default jumped up to 2nd, and 4th was now Oklahoma. 5, 6, and 7 saw Wisconsin, Auburn, and the team they just beat, Georgia. The November 21st rankings then saw more of the same. Alabama was still 1st, Michigan had jumped Clemson for the 2 spot, Clemson was 3rd, and Oklahoma was still 4th. Wisconsin was still 5th, Auburn was still 6th, Georgia was still 7th, and even 8 through 10 stayed the same, with Notre Dame staying put, Ohio State staying put, and Penn State staying put. And even for that matter, 11 USC and 12 TCU stayed the same, so not much change on this week. Now there is just 2 rankings to go, and on November 28th, Alabama would lose to the number 1 seed after losing the Iron Bowl 26-14. End result, Auburn jumped from 6th to 2nd, and the previous 2nd ranked team Miami had fallen to unranked Pitt, dropping them to 7th, while the rest of the field would just slide up a spot. Georgia was now 3rd, Wisconsin was 4th, Alabama was 5th, Georgia was 6th, Miami was 7th, Ohio State was 8th, Penn State was 9th, USC was 10th, and TCU was 11th. And that would all set up Championship Saturday. Number 2 Auburn would face number 6 Georgia in a win and in for the playoff. Number 1 Clemson would face number 7 Miami in the ACC Championship, with Miami's playoff hopes hanging by a thread. Number 8 Ohio State would face number 4 Wisconsin for the Big Ten in a must-win for Wisconsin. And number 10 USC would face number 12 Stanford for a trip to the Rose Bowl. And finally, the Big 12 Championship was back, with number 3 Oklahoma facing number 11 TCU. And in the SEC Championship, Georgia easily dispatched of Auburn 28-7. And the ACC Championship, Clemson put the dagger in Miami's playoff hopes with a 38-3 thrashing. In the Big Ten title, Ohio State beat Wisconsin 27-21, ending Wisconsin's title hopes and the Big Ten's chance at a playoff team. In the Pac-12 title, USC would beat Stanford 21-28, and lastly, Baker Mayfield and Oklahoma took care of business with a 41-17 victory over TCU. And that would give us on Selection Sunday, ACC champion Clemson the 1 seed, Big 12 champion Oklahoma at 2, SEC champion Georgia at 3, and just when you thought for a single second it wouldn't be Clemson versus Alabama, it was once again Clemson and Alabama as the Crimson Tide were awarded the 4th seed. Again, it just wouldn't be the mid-2010s without Curry versus Braun and Dabo versus Saban. It just wouldn't be right. So number 1 Clemson and number 4 Alabama would be sent to the All-State Sugar Bowl for their 3rd straight matchup in the playoff. And number 2 Oklahoma would face number 3 Georgia in Pasadena in what would become one of the greatest Rose Bowl games of all time. Unfortunately, this time Clemson vs. Alabama wouldn't deliver, and maybe that's just a curse of the semifinal games not being good. Clemson wasn't the same with Kelly Bryant under center, and Alabama took advantage with a 24-6 win to head to Atlanta for the national championship. But thankfully, the Rose Bowl game more than delivered. Georgia outlasted Heisman winner Baker Mayfield in Oklahoma 54-48 in what most call the greatest college football playoff game ever, and it's only fitting that it be in the Rose Bowl. And that fittingly would give us an all-SEC matchup in Atlanta for the national championship between Georgia and Alabama. This was the first time two teams from one conference made the playoff, and it immediately became the first time two teams from the same conference made the national championship. Now keep in mind, the playoff was really fast-tracked into existence from fan outcry after the first time two teams from the same conference met in the BCS National Championship game in 2011 between Alabama and LSU. Yet here we are in 2017, and because of, and only because of the playoff, we have an all-SEC National Championship featuring an Alabama team who wouldn't have even had a chance in the BCS era. So it's pretty interesting to look back at it in this way, but thankfully, unlike 2011, Georgia and Alabama would deliver one of the all-time great national championships. We all know the story. Alabama struggles offensively in the first half, but their defense keeps them in it. Saban pulls hurts for Tua, and we get to overtime and the rest is history. Touchdown, Alabama wins 26-23 in overtime. Now we're at 2018, and you guessed it, Alabama opened up the preseason at number 1 with Clemson at 2. Those two would be fighting to lock up a spot in either the Goodyear Cotton Bowl Classic or the Capital One Orange Bowl, and the winner of those games would play for the national championship in the home of Super Bowl 50, Levi Stadium in Santa Clara, California. The rest of the top 10 would see Georgia, Wisconsin, Ohio State, Washington, Oklahoma, Miami, Auburn, and Penn State. And by the time we get to the first rankings, Clemson would have inserted Trevor Lawrence as a starter over Kelly Bryant in a huge 28-26 victory over Texas A&M. And on the first October 30th rankings, Alabama would be the number 1 seed. And they had only one top 25 victory, which was also over Texas A&M where they beat them 45-23. That one common opponent is what put Bama over Clemson, as Clemson also had just one top 25 win, which was a 41-7 victory over NC State. So to 2 goes Clemson. At 3 we'd see LSU. Joe Burrow had transferred in and led them to many top 25 victories in games against number 8 Miami, number 7 Auburn, number 2 Georgia, and number 22 Mississippi State, but their lone loss against 22nd ranked Florida in a 27-19 loss is what put them at 3. But up next was their date with Alabama in Death Valley at night. But before we get to that, the rest of the field saw Notre Dame at 4, Michigan at 5, Georgia at 6, Oklahoma at 7, Washington State at 8, Kentucky at 9, and rounding out the top 10 was Ohio State. So how'd that LSU-Alabama game go? Well, Bama went into Baton Rouge and crushed them. Shut them out 29-0, an emphatic win to stay at number 1 and send LSU to 7th. Clemson stayed at 2, and by default, Notre Dame was 3rd, Michigan was 4th, Georgia was 5th, Oklahoma was 6th, and of course, there's LSU at 7. Washington State, West Virginia, and Ohio State rounded out the top 10. And now on to November 13th. And guess what? The entire top 10 stayed exactly the same, so we can skip to November 27th, and now there's consequences, because we had the game, Michigan and Ohio State. And Ohio State would walk away with a 62-39 victory, and more importantly, push Michigan out the playoff. Of course, Alabama, Clemson, and Notre Dame stayed put, and Georgia and Oklahoma set at 4 and 5. So Championship Saturday would be very important in deciding the playoff field. Number 1 Alabama and number 4 Georgia faced off in Atlanta in basically a win and end game. Clemson had an easy date with an unranked Pitt team. Ohio State had an easy date with 21st ranked Northwestern, but their playoff hopes were dashed. Number 11 Washington had to face off with number 17 Utah to decide who'd face those Buckeyes in Pasadena. And finally, number 5 Oklahoma would look to avenge their lone regular season loss to number 14 Texas to secure the final playoff spot. And just like in a movie script, in the SEC Championship almost a year later versus those same Georgia Bulldogs, it'd be Hurts coming in for an injured Tua to take down the Dogs 35-28 to send Alabama to the playoff. In other games, Washington escaped versus Utah 10-3, and Ohio State made quick work of Northwestern 45-24 to meet the Huskies in Pasadena. So there is one other game that decided the playoff picture, Red River Arlington style. In Oklahoma, behind the arm of the Heisman winner Kyler Murray, avenged their lone regular season loss to Texas 39-27. So SEC champ Alabama remains number 1. ACC champ Clemson sits at 2. Notre Dame would get the 3rd spot, and the coveted final spot went to Big 12 champion Oklahoma. Georgia was just left out at 5, 6 would go to Big Ten champion Ohio State, 7 would go to Michigan, who lost to those Buckeyes, 8 would go to UCF, Pac-12 champion Washington would be at 9, and to round it out, Florida was 10th. This would send number 2 Clemson and number 3 Notre Dame to the Cotton Bowl, and number 1 Alabama and number 4 Oklahoma to the Orange Bowl. And come on guys, you know where this is headed by now. Clemson would throttle Notre Dame 30-3 in Arlington, and Alabama destroyed Oklahoma in the Orange Bowl 45-34. Don't let the score fool you, this game was once 28-0 and 38-20 in the fourth quarter. So once again, it was inevitable that we'd see Clemson and Alabama in the national championship. 4 straight years of this match in January, and the two had just went wire to wire as number 1 and number 2 in the CFP. And just like the last matchup, this one just didn't have the same spark. It started out close in the first quarter, but if you remember, this was the Justin Ross game, and the true freshman connection from Trevor Lawrence led to a 44-16 rout in the national championship. Oh, and you guessed it, 2019 sees Clemson open up at number 1 and Alabama at number 2. And yet again, they'd be playing for a trip to either the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl or the PlayStation Fiesta Bowl for a shot at getting to the Superdome in New Orleans for the national championship. 3 through 10 would see Georgia, Oklahoma, Ohio State, LSU, Michigan, Florida, Notre Dame, and Texas to round out the preseason poll. And all of a sudden, by the time we got to the first rankings on November 5th, Clemson nor Alabama were in the top 2. It was number 1 Ohio State and number 2 LSU who took the top 2 spots. With Alabama at 3, Penn State at 4, Clemson at 5, Georgia at 6, Oregon at 7, Utah at 8, Oklahoma with Jalen Hurts at 9, and Florida rounded out the top 10 at number 10. But of course, we had the classic LSU-Alabama matchup coming up before the next rankings, number 2 versus number 3. And for LSU, this was their best chance at taking down Alabama. They had the team of Burrow, Chase, and Jefferson and hadn't beaten Alabama since 2011. So what would happen? Well, LSU finally did it. They beat Alabama 46-41 in an all-time classic. LSU took the number 1 spot from Ohio State, and Alabama fell to 5th. Also, we'd see Penn State fall in the rankings as they lose to 17th ranked Minnesota 31-26. The rankings were now LSU at 1, Ohio State at 2, Clemson back in the top 4 at 3, Georgia at 4, Alabama down to 5, Oregon at 6, Utah at 7, Minnesota after their win versus Penn State slides up from 17 to 8, Penn State falls to 9, and Oklahoma now at 10. The November 19th rankings then stayed the same for the most part. The top 7 stayed put, and the only change was Penn State jumping up to 8, Oklahoma jumping up to 9, and Minnesota falling to 10. And then on November 26th, Ohio State would jump LSU for the number 1 spot after their win versus number 8 Penn State 28-17. The other major shift was number 6 Oregon falling to an unranked Arizona State team 31-28. This would cause them to slide back to 14, effectively ending their playoff hopes. The new rankings were now Ohio State, LSU, Clemson, Georgia, and Alabama remaining the 1 through 5. 6 was now Utah, 7 was now Oklahoma, 8 was Minnesota, 9 was Baylor, and 10 was Penn State. And that set up rivalry weekend. Alabama with a massive matchup versus Auburn to put themselves in position to make the playoff, and Ohio State would be facing a top 15 Michigan team looking to finally beat the Buckeyes in the Harbaugh era. But only one of them took care of business. Keep in mind, this was after Tua went down with an injury for the season, but offense was not the problem in their 48-45 loss in Jordan Hare. Ohio State meanwhile clinched a Big Ten title spot with their 56-27 rout over Michigan. But this would mean one thing. Finally, we were free from the depths of Clemson versus Alabama in January. But before we get to the playoff, we had conference championship weekend. Number 1 Ohio State versus number 8 Wisconsin, number 13 Oregon versus number 5 Utah, number 4 Oklahoma versus number 7 Baylor, and no Alabama in Atlanta as it'd be number 2 LSU and number 4 Georgia. And let's just start with the dominant showing by the LSU Tigers. A 37-10 win over number 4 Georgia would end Georgia's playoff hopes and effectively push LSU to the number 1 seed. Then in the Big Ten Championship, Ohio State would take out number 8 Wisconsin 34-21 to position themselves as the 2 seed. They'd then be facing the number 3 seeded Clemson Tigers, who beat number 23 UVA like a drum in a 62-17 final. And the last conference title game that had any playoff implications was Oklahoma, led by the Alabama transfer Jalen Hurts, escaping with a 30-23 overtime final over 7th ranked Baylor to secure the last playoff spot. And then to determine the Rose Bowl participant from the Pac-12, Oregon would pummel Utah 37-15. And there you have it, number 1 LSU the SEC champ, number 2 Ohio State the Big Ten champ, number 3 Clemson the ACC champ, and number 4 Oklahoma the Big 12 champ in the playoff. and the first two out would be number 5 Georgia and number 6 Oregon. And that would set up number 1 LSU versus number 4 Oklahoma in the Peach Bowl, and at night number 2 Ohio State versus number 3 Clemson in the Fiesta Bowl. And of course LSU would beat Oklahoma like a drum to continue the trend of horrible playoff semifinal games. The final score was 63-28. Man, and watching this really just made me think of all the blowout CFP semifinals we had seen up until this point. But thankfully in the nightcap, Ohio State and Clemson would deliver one of the greatest playoff games we've ever seen. And in a 29-23 classic that came down to the final moments, Trevor Lawrence and the Tigers prevailed to get a date with the other Tigers from Baton Rouge in their backyard of New Orleans, Louisiana. And now that the matchup was set, we'd see Trevor Lawrence, who had not lost a game in his collegiate career, leading out the number 2 ranked Clemson Tigers against the new juggernaut the SEC had to offer this year in a record-breaking LSU Tiger team. And Clemson started out well, but LSU's offense proved to be too much, and the LSU Tigers would walk away with a 42-25 victory to score on their 3rd national championship since 2000 and their first of the college football playoff era. Now we've had 4 different national champions in the 6 years of the playoff existence: Ohio State, Alabama, Clemson, and now LSU. And then the whole world would come to a screeching halt, and the 2020 season will look like a season we've never seen before thanks to the pandemic. Just barely we made it, but we would see a college football season featuring all conference schedules, and just a heads up, Ohio State would only play 6 regular season games. Preseason number 1 would be the Tigers, but not the reigning national champion LSU Tigers. Instead, it was the runner-up for the title, Clemson Tigers. The 2020 LSU Tigers lost almost everybody from the 2019 team. Names like Joe Burrow, Justin Jefferson, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire were in the draft. Meanwhile, Jamar Chase used his opt-out, so yeah, they were gashed. The team that Clemson beat in the semifinal, Ohio State, was ranked 2nd, and oh boy would a rematch be cinematic. Alabama was 3rd, and Georgia was 4th to round out the top 4. Oklahoma was 5th with new quarterback Spencer Rattler, LSU was 6th, Penn State was 7th, Florida was 8th, Oregon was 9th, and Notre Dame closed out the top 10 at 10. These teams will be fighting for a trip to either the Rose Bowl game presented by Capital One, which would funny enough go on to be held in AT&T Stadium, or they'd be looking to get to the All-State Sugar Bowl to have a chance at getting to Miami Gardens, Florida for the national championship in Hard Rock Stadium. And I don't know exactly how I'll explain this season, but on November 24th in the inaugural rankings, Alabama would open up number 1, and just a little spoiler, they'd be number 1 the entire season. At 2 was Notre Dame, and spoiler, they'd be number 2 all the way up until Selection Day. At 3 was Clemson, and spoiler, they'd be number 3 all the way up until Selection Day. And at 4 was Ohio State, and again, spoiler, they'd be number 4 all the way up until Selection Day. So for the first time ever, the top 4 of the inaugural college football playoff rankings stayed exactly the same all the way up until the penultimate rankings. And then on Selection Sunday, it'd be confirmed that all 4 of the teams who were ranked top 4 in the initial rankings never at any point dropped out the top 4. Just a little backstory on these teams, Alabama was just straight up dominant. They went undefeated versus an all-SEC schedule that included a 52-24 win over 13th ranked Texas A&M, who'd finished at 5th on Selection Sunday. Also includes a 41-24 victory over 3rd ranked Georgia, a 42-13 win over 22nd ranked Auburn in the Iron Bowl, and lastly a 55-17 win over the defending national champion LSU Tigers, who albeit did lose a ton from the previous team. Now we move to Notre Dame, and I'll be the first to say this schedule was an absolute joke. But they did win their only major test, which was a 47-42 overtime win against Clemson without their star quarterback Trevor Lawrence, who caught the virus. But again, if your team puts up 40 points, then that wasn't the backup quarterback's fault. So good for Notre Dame. And of course, their only other ranked win was versus the 19th ranked North Carolina, who they beat 31-17. And now let's move on to the team that suffered their lone loss to Notre Dame, Clemson. Now Clemson's schedule is also charming and ultra soft. Outside their loss to Notre Dame, they only faced one other ranked team, and to their credit, they made quick work of 7th ranked Miami 42-17, but the rest of the games were just obvious Clemson wins. And then we get to the last team in this dance, Ohio State, and my goodness, they only played a grand total of 5 regular season games. They beat Nebraska 52-17, they would beat 18th ranked Penn State 38-25, but Penn State would go on to start the season 0-5. They then beat Rutgers 49-27, their game versus Maryland was canceled, then they got a good win versus 9th ranked Indiana 42-25, but guess what, their next game versus Illinois was canceled, then they beat MSU 52-12, and then the cherry on top, the game versus Michigan was canceled. So the penultimate ranking saw Bama at 1, Notre Dame at 2, Clemson at 3, and then lastly Ohio State at 4. And that was set up conference championship weekend. The SEC had number 1 Bama versus number 7 Florida in what would be an incredible 52-46 victory for the Tide. The ACC championship set up the Clemson-Notre Dame rematch where Clemson this time with Trevor Lawrence convincingly beat the Irish 34-10. Then somehow Ohio State finds themselves in a Big Ten title where they took care of number 14 Northwestern 22-10. So there's the playoff. All that changed was Clemson and Notre Dame switched spots. In the other conference title games, unranked Oregon beat number 13 USC 31-24, and in the Big 12, number 10 Oklahoma beat number 6 Iowa State 27-21. This 2020 season was the most uneventful, I'd say, and a lot of that was thanks to the handicapping of schedules, the opt-outs, and players missing games. But a quick rundown of the top 10 on Selection Sunday was number 1 Alabama, the SEC champ, number 2 Clemson, the ACC champ, number 3 Notre Dame, the independent but also ACC runner-up, number 4 Ohio State, the Big Ten champ, number 5 Texas A&M, who was 5th in every single ranking, number 6 Oklahoma, the Big 12 champ, who jumped up 4 spots, number 7 Florida, the SEC runner-up, who fell a spot, number 8 Cincinnati, and I'll just say watch out for them next year, number 9 Georgia, yeah, also watch out for them next year, and lastly number 10 Iowa State. This would give us number 1 Alabama versus number 4 Notre Dame in the Rose Bowl game in Arlington, Texas, because of course California mask mandates. And then the main event, number 2 Clemson versus number 3 Ohio State in the Sugar Bowl, the rematch of last year's classic in Arizona. Let's get the Temu Rose Bowl game out the way. Alabama embarrassed Notre Dame. So yeah, yet another semifinal blowout as the Tide won 31-14. And then in the Sugar Bowl, all the talk around this one was that Ohio State deserved to beat her and everything like that because of their schedule. And then in a result not many expected, Justin Fields with half working ribs had the best game of his career as Trevor Lawrence took his second career loss. Yet again it came in the Superdome in a 49-28 loss. This one was a shocker, and all of a sudden Ohio State found themselves in the national championship against Alabama. And we know how this one ends. We saw 2 playoff blowouts leading up to this game in Miami Gardens, Florida. Blowout number 3 was inevitable. Alabama demolished the Buckeyes 52-24 with the Heisman winner Devontae Smith having his way with Sean Wade. It's so signature for this to happen. 3 playoff games, 3 blowouts. And on to 2021 where we'd hope for once we can get 2 close semifinal games because if memory serves me correct, at least one of the semifinal games has been a blowout every single year. So I assume you guys already guessed correctly that Alabama opened up 2021 number 1, but number 2 wouldn't be Clemson or Ohio State, it'd be Oklahoma. Spencer Rattler had some motion back in the day. At 3rd would be Clemson, 4th Ohio State, 5th Georgia, and 6th Texas A&M. Those were the heavyweight contenders. Now at 7 you get Iowa State, 8 Cincinnati, 9 Notre Dame, and 10 North Carolina. Also, now we have full crowds back in the stands, and the semifinal bowl games would be back to the Goodyear Cotton Bowl and the Capital One Orange Bowl to get to Indianapolis for the national championship game. And oh boy, I don't think we've ever seen this much turnaround going into the first CFP rankings as we did on November 2nd. The new number 1 was Georgia, and what a resume they had put up. Week 1 they came out victorious in a defensive battle against number 3 Clemson. Then they had 3 straight top 25 matchups they came out victorious in. A 37-0 shutout versus number 8 Arkansas, a 34-10 win over number 18 Auburn, and a 30-13 victory over number 11 Kentucky. So yeah, this was the clear number 1. And number 2 was their SEC rival Alabama. They had a 44-13 showing in their opener versus number 14 Miami. Then 2 weeks later, a 31-29 classic with number 11 Florida. And then 2 weeks after that, a 42-21 victory over number 12 Ole Miss before their 41-38 loss to Texas A&M in another classic that came down to the final seconds. Then at 3rd was a shocker. Michigan State in the top 3 after opening up the year unranked. They were undefeated entering their first rankings and had 2 top 25 wins, one of them being over 24th ranked Miami 38-17 and the other being over number 6 ranked Michigan in the Kenneth Walker legacy game. After MSU was Oregon at 4. Oregon in 2021 had went into the horseshoe and beat Ohio State 35-28. Speaking of Ohio State, they'd be ranked right behind Oregon at 5th. Obviously their one loss was to the Ducks themselves. And then 6th was Cincinnati in their Desmond Ridder and Sauce Gardner year. And their season was propelled after a massive win in South Bend over a top 10 Notre Dame team, which was a very important win as it'd be their only ranked win of the regular season. And then at number 7 was Michigan. Yes, folks, 2021, the year of the return of Michigan football. Both teams came into the year unranked, and yet here we are with both of them sitting in the top 7 in position to make the playoff. 8th was Oklahoma, who, yes, they were undefeated, but they were barely scathing by with Rattler at quarterback. They had a 5-point win over Tulane, a 7-point win over Nebraska, a 3-point win over West Virginia, and to close it out, a 6-point win over Kansas State. All unranked teams. That set up Red River against 21st ranked Texas, where after a slow start and facing a massive deficit, Caleb Williams was inserted to save Oklahoma's season 55-48. Then at 9th was Wake Forest, and 10 was Notre Dame. But wait, where's Clemson? Yes, preseason number 3 Clemson was unranked in the first college football playoff rankings. They had lost the opener to Georgia 10-3, lost to unranked South Carolina 27-21 in 2 overtimes, and then lost to 23rd ranked Pitt 27-17. Not to mention they only beat Georgia Tech by 6, Boston College by 6, and Syracuse by 3. So the high expectations placed around DJU after the Notre Dame game in 2020 quickly turned to disappointment. And speaking of disappointment, 1 week after beating Michigan, Michigan State lost to unranked Purdue 40-29 and dropped to 7 the next week. Georgia and Alabama stayed 1-2, and Oregon, Ohio State, Cincinnati, and Michigan by default jumped up to 3, 4, 5, and 6, while Michigan State, as earlier said, dropped to 7. Oklahoma State put at 8, and Notre Dame was now number 9 after Wake Forest fell out the top 10 in their narrow loss to UNC 58-55. Oklahoma State would take their place. Now we're at November 16th, and the top 7 of Georgia, Alabama, Oregon, Ohio State, Cincinnati, Michigan, and Michigan State would stay the same. At 8, Oklahoma's luck had run out and they lost to 13th ranked Baylor 27-14. The new 8 was now Notre Dame, and now at 9 was Oklahoma State, and that let Wake Forest into the top 10. And finally, on November 23rd, we'd see massive change in the rankings. Georgia stayed number 1, but Alabama fell to 3 after Ohio State's massive 56-7 win over 7th ranked Michigan State. But wait, all of a sudden, Cincinnati is number 4. Where's Oregon? Well, Oregon fell all the way to 11 after their 38-7 loss to 23rd ranked Utah. Now Michigan was 5th, Notre Dame was 6th, and Oklahoma State, taking advantage of Michigan State's fall to 12, was now 7th. Baylor was 8th, the lane train Ole Miss was now in the top 10 at 9, and to close it out, Oklahoma was 10th. So now it's time for the penultimate rankings on November 30th. This was coming off the heels of some major rivalry games. We had number 2 Ohio State in the game versus number 5 Michigan, and for the first time since 2011, Michigan would beat Ohio State. And then in the Iron Bowl, number 2 Alabama would need the heroics of Bryce Young to walk away with a 24-22 win in 4 overtimes against an unranked Auburn team in what was a defensive struggle. So now we have, of course, Georgia number 1, Michigan number 2, Alabama falls to 3, and then there's Cincinnati hanging on to that 4 spot with Oklahoma State and Notre Dame the first 2 out, and then Ohio State on the outside looking in at 7. Ole Miss, Baylor, and Oregon were the 8 through 10. Now that set up Conference Championship Weekend and Selection Sunday. The SEC was the number 1 Georgia versus number 3 Bama in a must-win for Alabama. The Big Ten, for the first time ever, would see number 2 Michigan as they'd face number 13 Iowa. The ACC would see number 17 Pitt versus number 18 Wake Forest. Yeah, when was the last time Clemson wasn't in this game? The Pac-12 would see number 14 Utah versus number 10 Oregon. The Big Ten would see number 9 Baylor versus Oklahoma State in the game with major playoff implications. And wait a minute, now we're bringing up the AAC championship game, as number 4 Cincinnati would have one last obstacle in the way of their playoff ticket in a game versus 21st ranked Houston. And let's start with the games that didn't really have playoff implications. Pitt beat Wake Forest 45-21 and Utah crushed Oregon 38-10. And now we start with the Big Ten title. Michigan would punch their first ticket to the dance in a 42-3 rout over Iowa. Then in the Big 12, number 9 Baylor would stop number 5 Oklahoma State at the goal line in the final seconds to end their playoff hopes in a 21-16 loss. Then in the AAC, Cincinnati took care of business in a 35-20 win over Houston. So that sends us to Atlanta. You know the stigma behind Georgia and Alabama. Kirby just couldn't beat Saban. But now the tables have turned. Georgia was number 1. Meanwhile, Alabama had limped into this game after just surviving versus Auburn, and none of it mattered. Bryce Young had a flawless performance to secure the Heisman Trophy and a 41-24 win to secure their playoff spot. So on Selection Sunday, it was SEC champion Alabama taking back the number 1 spot, Big Ten champion Michigan stayed put at 2, SEC runner-up Georgia fell to 3rd, and Cincinnati, the AAC champion, becomes the first G5 team to make the dance. And the first 2 out would be Notre Dame and Ohio State. Big 12 champion Baylor, Ole Miss, and Michigan State would be the 7 through 10. Now for the bowl matchups. Number 4 Cincinnati would get a date with number 1 Alabama in the Cotton Bowl, and then it'd be number 2 Michigan versus number 3 Georgia in the Orange Bowl. And oh boy, were these games hard to watch. Yet again, the trend continues of playoff blowouts. Alabama beat Cincinnati 27-6 off of just being better at every position sans cornerback. It wasn't an entertaining Alabama performance either. They had lost John Mechie for the year in the SEC Championship, and yeah, it was just a hard watch as Cincinnati's offense wasn't ever able to put anything together, and the defense was too good to let it be an embarrassing blowout. And then at night in the Orange Bowl, Michigan just got flat out embarrassed. I don't think at any point the SEC supremacy narrative was stronger than it was in this playoff. Georgia decimated Michigan 34-11 in another just boring showing. At least Georgia had some explosive plays, but these games just looked like two teams that didn't belong on the field with the SEC Championship matchup. So yet again, we found ourselves with Alabama and Georgia in the National Championship. And to be honest, it was only ever going to be that. And the National Championship was a slugfest in the first half. Jameson Williams was now out with a torn ACL, and now you're looking at Bryce Young without his wide receiver 1 and 2 going against an all-time defense. But he still had them in great position to win. Then all the momentum shifted and Georgia would eventually walk away with a 33-18 win after a failed game-tying drive ending in a pick 6. But man, were people frustrated with the playoff. The monster that you the fans all begged for has now produced blowout after blowout. And for the SEC haters, oh man, you've now given one of Alabama or Georgia a second shot at making the national championship because of the playoff. And let's be real, they faced a team that they were always going to beat every time in the semifinal. So yes, the playoff was technically working in the sense of making sure the best teams play in the Natty, but for those against LSU and Alabama in 2011, how could you not have seen this coming? Now just 2 years to go. Preseason number 1 is of course Alabama. I mean, they were within a drive of another ring without their top 2 receivers. But then you have Ohio State at 2, and now it's like, hold up. Finally, Georgia was at 3. Clemson makes their way back into the picture after a down year. Notre Dame was 5th. Texas A&M was 6th. Utah was 7th. Michigan all the way down to 8. Oklahoma at 9, and Baylor at 10. These teams will be fighting for a trip to the newly named Verbo Fiesta Bowl or the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl to earn the right to play for the national championship in the all-new SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California. And on November 1st, it'd be Tennessee ranked number 1. They earned this ranking after taking down number 1 Alabama in one of the best games of the decade. Next up, we have Ohio State. And they had a massive win in week 1 against 5th ranked Notre Dame, but they had to pay for it as they'd essentially lose Jackson Smith and Jigba for the season. Outside of that, their only other top 25 matchup to this point was a 44-31 win against Penn State. At 3 was Georgia, but don't worry, they'll have their shot at number 1 immediately. 4th was Clemson, 5th was Michigan, 6th was Alabama, still trying to bounce back from their loss to Tennessee, and at 7 was TCU, who had an impressive schedule taking down number 18 Oklahoma, number 19 Kansas, number 8 Oklahoma State, and number 17 Kansas State in consecutive weeks. Behind them was Oregon at 8, USC at 9, and LSU at 10. By the way, that's the Caleb Williams Heisman year for USC as they'd make a serious push for the playoff. In the second rankings, we'd see major change as Georgia would stomp number 1 Tennessee 27-13 to advance to the number 1 seed themselves as Tennessee fell to 5. Ohio State was still number 2 as everyone knew their season was coming down to the game against the Wolverines. Those Wolverines would actually come in at number 3 this week as the team that was in front of them, Clemson, had lost to an unranked Notre Dame team 35-14. And by this point, Clemson basically turned into Celtics Shaq. Like, they went from dominating the regular season and locking up a playoff spot every single year to just hanging around at random places in the top 25. So Clemson was now 10th. At 4 is now those TCU Horned Frogs. Tennessee, as mentioned, was 5th, Oregon was 6th, LSU was 7th after a massive victory against Alabama, USC was 8th, Alabama was all the way down to 9 after they lost in Death Valley at night to Jaden Daniels, effectively ending their playoff hopes, and Clemson was 10th. November 15th saw 1 through 5 stay put, but Oregon would fall from 6 to 12 after suffering a 37-34 loss to 25th ranked Washington. This would result in LSU, USC, Alabama, and Clemson all climbing up a spot, with the Utah Utes taking that final spot in the top 10. Now it's November 22nd, and 1 through 4 stays the same. But now LSU is 5 after Tennessee got beat like a drum by South Carolina 63-28 by guess who? Spencer Rattler. What a comeback story. USC was now 6th, Alabama was 7th, Clemson still sneaking around at 8, Oregon was 9th, and to close it out, as mentioned, Tennessee was 10th. And then it set up rivalry weekend, and most importantly, the game. And yeah, as Matt B. Great says, Ohio State officially became Little Bro. Michigan went into Columbus and not just beat the Buckeyes, but they embarrassed them 45-23. This would lead to Georgia keeping the 1 and Michigan now taking the 2nd spot. This would all of a sudden give TCU a top 3 seed, and USC, who had a classic performance from the Heisman Trophy winner Caleb Williams, would get the 4th seed, with Ohio State now looking in from the outside. Ohio State was at 5, and then we'd see a 2-loss Alabama at 6, who still thought they were one of the best 4 teams in college football. But Ohio State and Alabama's only hope at the playoff would come on Championship Saturday, or Friday night in the all-important Pac-12 Championship between USC and Utah. So let's start at the Pac-12 Championship. USC's one lone regular season loss came against Utah, and here they were meeting again. Utah was fighting for a trip to the Rose Bowl. USC was fighting to hold on to their playoff spot. And just like in the regular season matchup, USC would fall. But this time it wasn't even close. Utah drilled the Trojans 47-24 to end Lincoln's hope of a playoff appearance in year 1. People in Columbus cheered, as barring a massive shakeup, this would give them USC's playoff spot. Now in the SEC, let's just get this out the way. Georgia made quick work of number 14 LSU 50-30. In the ACC, a 9th-ranked Clemson team would crush UNC 39-10. In the Big 12, TCU would actually lose 31-28 in overtime to 10th-ranked Kansas State, but it'd be irrelevant as they wouldn't even fall in the rankings. And lastly, in the Big 10 championship, Michigan would easily dismantle an unranked Purdue team 43-22. So a pretty uneventful day for the most part. But that set up a selection Sunday of number 1 Georgia, number 2 Michigan, number 3 TCU, and number 4 Ohio State. Alabama and Tennessee were the first 2 out, and Clemson, Utah, Kansas State, and USC were the 7 through 10. This would give us number 2 Michigan versus number 3 TCU in the Verbo Fiesta Bowl, and then number 1 Georgia versus number 4 Ohio State in the Peach Bowl. For the first time ever, we were facing a chance at a Michigan-Ohio State national championship game in the playoff era. The very thing the college football world feared in 2006 was a very real possibility. And it seemed essentially a lock that Michigan would make the national championship. They had just beaten the Buckeyes, and this time instead of Georgia, it'd be Cinderella TCU in their way. And let's start with that game. Unbelievably, TCU would pull off the upset and defeat the Wolverines 51-45 to punch their ticket to the national championship. But more importantly, oh my goodness, we just watched a good college football playoff semifinal. The first time we've had a remotely entertaining semifinal since Clemson and Ohio State in 2019. And guess who was on the TV next? Ohio State. Could they do it again? Could this be the day for the first time ever we see 2 entertaining college football playoff semifinals? I mean, Ohio State was the team that was looked at as soft. They had just been embarrassed in their own place. And then on that night, we'd see a CJ Stroud and Ryan Day we had never seen before. Ohio State had a monster start and Georgia bounced back. In pushing Georgia to the brink of elimination, Ohio State's game-winning field goal fell short as the clock struck midnight, and the Bulldogs survived 42-41 in a classic. For the first time ever, 2 elite and entertaining college football playoff semifinals. I never thought we'd see the day. But now there is one game left, the national championship, TCU versus Georgia. Could we see 3 good games in a row? It was truly David versus Goliath. And what a horrible game. The price we had to play for 2 entertaining semifinals was the biggest blowout in bowl game history and the biggest blowout in a national championship game ever. And I mean, I think most people expected a non-competitive game because it was Georgia, but for it to be this much of a blowout was a shocker. And that would lead us to the final year of the college football playoff, a system that for 9 years had produced for the most part lackluster games and really had proven that there was no need for a playoff expansion would be put to the test this year. Because for the first time literally ever, we'd see a major controversy, a year in college football that would lead to lawsuits and utter chaos. Very fitting that in the final year of what was left in traditional college football, with the Pac-12 still existing and Texas and OU in their final year in the Big 12, we see the return of the Horns in the best year the Pac-12 had seen in a long time. So buckle up, because this is the final chapter of the 14 college football playoff. The preseason would see Georgia number 1. We all knew this. Michigan would be 2, their rivals in Columbus would be 3, Alabama would be 4, their rivals in Baton Rouge would be 5, USC would be 6, Penn State would be 7, Florida State would be 8, Clemson would be 9th, and Washington was 10th. Also important to know that Texas was the 11th ranked team, and the defending national champion runner-ups TCU were 17th. These teams would be fighting for a trip to the Rose Bowl game presented by Prudential, or the All-State Sugar Bowl for a trip to Houston, Texas for the national championship. Okay, so I usually skip right to the CFP rankings, but this was the most wild season since like 2007, so I'll highlight a few important games. Right out the gate, the newly formed Colorado team of Deion, Shedeur, and Travis Hunter would beat TCU 45-42 to knock them out of the top 25. So that's the end of their story. Now on to Clemson, and boom, their season was immediately over as they'd suffer a 28-7 loss to unranked Duke. Yeah, it's crazy to see Clemson suffering these type of losses after they've dominated for so much of this video, but again, Celtics Shaq. Then we had a massive top 10 matchup between number 5 LSU and number 8 Florida State. And it was a back and forth battle early on. The Seminoles would pull away for a 45-24 victory to put themselves in position for a playoff berth. Now on to Texas, and yeah, they were back. They went into Tuscaloosa and finished the job they started the year before, knocking off number 3 Alabama 34-24. And then the Washington Huskies, who started at 10, were now poised for a playoff spot after they pulled off a huge victory versus 8th ranked Oregon 36-33. So now we make the first CFP rankings. Ohio State was number 1, largely in part to their victories over number 9 Notre Dame and South Bend 17-14 at the buzzer, and their 20-12 victory over 7th ranked Penn State, completely dominating on defense. Georgia was number 2 as they had looked dominant versus a pretty weak schedule, but they'd have a string of tough top 25 matchups later in the year. Michigan was 3rd, and yet again a very weak schedule facing 0 top 25 teams, but again they had a 2-game season. Penn State and Ohio State. Florida State was 4th, still being propelled by their victory against LSU, and now their only other top 25 win, which was versus number 16 Duke. 5th was Washington, who had their win versus Oregon and now had a massive game coming up against a faltering USC team led by Caleb Williams. 6th was Oregon, who again just had the one loss to Washington. And then at 7 was Texas, who was still recovering from their loss to the Sooners in Red River. At 8 was Alabama, who of course was behind the Longhorns, who they lost to head-to-head. 9 was Oklahoma, who after their massive win versus Texas lost to Kansas, dropping them right before the first rankings. And at 10 to close it out was Ole Miss, who had an L to Alabama. In their second rankings on November 2nd, 1 through 8 would stay the same. The major change would be Oklahoma taking yet another loss, their second in a row, and a 27-24 loss to number 22 Oklahoma State. This would severely hurt their Big 12 title chances. Then Ole Miss and Penn State would jump up a spot to take over 9 and 10. On next week's November 14th rankings, we'd have a new number 1. Remember when I said Georgia had a difficult schedule coming up? Well yeah, the week before they beat number 12 Missouri 30-21, and here they beat number 9 Ole Miss 52-17. That dropped Ohio State to 2, meanwhile yet again 3 through 8 would stay the same. And yet again 9 would change, as of course Ole Miss fell to 13 after their loss, and Missouri would take that spot, with Louisville now getting in the top 10, jumping up a spot. November 21st would give us 1, 2, and 3 staying put, but at 4 Washington would jump Florida State after Washington took down 11th ranked Oregon State, and simultaneously on that November 18th day, starting Florida State quarterback Jordan Travis would go down for the season with a broken leg. And this event right here would cause a can of worms to open. Also, the 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 of Oregon, Texas, Alabama, Missouri, and Louisville stayed put. And through 4 rankings so far, Oregon, Texas, and Alabama haven't moved once. But that changed on November 28th, which of course came after rivalry weekend. But we started at the top. Georgia stayed put at 1, which was expected. But then the consequential Michigan-Ohio State game in Ann Arbor would see yet again the Buckeyes falter under pressure to their arch rival as they'd go down 30-24. And obviously the game is important every year, but this was the rare year in the 4-team era where Ohio State couldn't afford a loss in this game for their first loss of the year and not make the playoff, because there were about 8 or more playoff-worthy teams for the first time maybe ever. And that'd be proven as the Buckeyes fell to 6th. In front of them was Michigan at 2, Washington now at 3, Florida State jumped back up to 4, and Oregon was 5th. And creeping up right behind the Buckeyes was Texas at 7 and Alabama at 8. 2 teams who both had conference championships to play for, whereas Ohio State would be sitting at home watching on their TVs. So now we have the all-consequential conference championship weekend. In the Pac-12, we'd have the number 3 Washington versus number 5 Oregon rematch in a win-and-end scenario to make the playoff. In the Big 12, we'd have the 7th ranked Texas Longhorns versus the 18th ranked Oklahoma State Cowboys in a game where if Texas won, they'd likely be in the dance, but a loss would be detrimental. In the SEC, we'd see the number 1 ranked Georgia Bulldogs versus the number 8 ranked Alabama Crimson Tide. Usually the 8th ranked team wouldn't be playing for a playoff ticket, but this year was different, and a loss for Georgia could drop them from 1 to out of it all. In the Big 10, number 2 Michigan would have a must-win versus number 16 Iowa. And lastly, in the ACC, we'd see the all-important number 4 Florida State versus number 4 Louisville matchup. Yes, FSU and Louisville was the most important game of the day. So for the first time ever, every Power 5 conference champ game had meaning in regard to the playoff. All 5 games were consequential, and it'd be 5 conferences who all think they deserve a bid to the dance, but only 4 tickets were available, so who would prevail? We'll start in the order of events. On Friday night in the Pac-12 title game, the number 3 Washington Huskies would beat the number 5 Oregon Ducks for the second time in the season, 34-31 to secure their playoff spot in the Pac-12's playoff spot. On Saturday at noon, the number 7 Texas Longhorns pummeled number 18 Oklahoma State 49-21 to put themselves in great position to make the playoff. Then in the SEC Championship, all chaos ensued as Isaiah Bond single-handedly dragged number 8 Alabama to a 27-24 win over the number 1 ranked Georgia Bulldogs, who hadn't lost a game since the SEC Championship game in 2021. And then let's just start with the obvious. Number 2 Michigan throttled number 16 Iowa to secure their playoff spot and the number 1 seed after Georgia's loss. So let's set the stage. Michigan was in from the Big Ten at number 1. Washington was in from the Pac-12 at number 2. Texas from the Big 12 had put themselves in great position to make the playoff. Alabama from the SEC had put themselves in great position to make the playoff. And if you remember, Texas has a head-to-head win over Alabama. But number 1 Georgia still felt they had a claim as it was their first loss all year, but no conference championship made it virtually impossible. So now it all comes down to Florida State. A Florida State team who looked horrible offensively against Florida with their QB2 Tate Rodemaker. And now he got hurt, and QB3 Brock Glenn was now inserted as starter for the ACC title game, a true freshman. And when I say the playoff, the networks, the whole country almost, just wanted Florida State to lose, because this clearly wasn't the same team as they were with Jordan Travis, yet they still had an unblemished record. A loss here to Louisville would solve all the committee's problems and make it easy, and well, that didn't happen. Florida State in another horrible offensive outing, barely scraped by Louisville in a nasty 16-6 win. You know what I'm talking about if you watch this live. So now it's Selection Sunday, and what do you do with Florida State? Were they still a top 4 team in the country by this point? Probably not. But they were an undefeated conference champion, and never before had an undefeated conference champion been left out the playoff. So stating the obvious again, Big Ten champion Michigan was number 1, and Pac-12 champion Washington was number 2. So who'd be 3 and 4? The committee saw Big 12 champion and 1-loss Texas, whose lone loss was a 34-30 defeat in the final seconds versus their rival Oklahoma, as a good enough resume to secure the 3rd spot, which was also boosted by their victory over SEC champion Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And now the final spot was between SEC champion and 1-loss Alabama and ACC champion and no-loss Florida State. Never before had the SEC been completely left out the playoff, and also never before had an undefeated Power 5 conference champion missed the playoff. Something had to give, and the committee chose Alabama. You had to know the SEC wasn't being left out the playoff, and Florida State struggling to even garner first downs in the ACC championship did them in. So did they make the right decision? Let me know in the comments if you're Team Kirk Herbstreit or Team Knowles. Of course, FSU was ranked 5th, and Georgia fell all the way from 1 to 6. Which to me might be more surprising than the Florida State stuff. The rest of the top 10 saw Ohio State at 7, Oregon at 8, Missouri at 9, and Penn State at 10. And before I get to the playoff matchups, the committee is very funny for giving us a Florida State-Georgia playoff leftovers matchup where Georgia played their starters and everyone in the FSU program opted out, leading to a 63-3 Orange Bowl loss in one of the funniest days on Twitter ever. But now to the playoff. Number 1 Michigan would match up with number 4 Alabama in the Rose Bowl game, which was in Pasadena, California for the first time in a semifinal since 2017. And then the number 2 ranked Washington Huskies would match up with the number 3 ranked Texas Longhorns in the Sugar Bowl. And the most unexpected thing happened. For the second consecutive year, we saw 2 amazing semifinal games. Michigan stopped Alabama at the goal line to win a classic Rose Bowl game in their classic Rose Bowl uniforms 27-20 in overtime. And then in the nightcap, the Huskies would stop the Longhorns' comeback efforts 37-31 in the closing seconds of the Sugar Bowl. 2 all-time games to set up a classic Pac-12 vs. Big Ten national championship game. But instead of it being under the sunset of the San Gabriel Mountains in Pasadena, California, it was in Houston, Texas in a dome. But looking past that, just like last year, the national championship would be pretty underwhelming. Washington didn't have anything left as Penix was pretty nicked up by the Michigan defense in Michigan's 34-13 win to secure the final 14 college football playoff national championship and cap off an undefeated season. And I must say, This was a really fun video to make, covering every single college football playoff ranking for a decade, seeing how things unfolded and how the playoffs survived an era of very lackluster games to eventually end up with classics and one final controversy just like the BCS, with a team suing their conference and causing the utmost chaos we hadn't seen in years. Also, I think this video shows that there was never a need for an extended playoff in the 2010s when it was just the Alabama-Clemson Invitational. The level of talent was so paramount in that era, where they met 4 straight years in January. The talent gap from the 3rd to even 4th best team was so huge. Now with NIL and the transfer portal, things have pretty evened out. Now Alabama can't have 5 stars just riding the bench, as other teams are going to offer them a massive bag and starting spot, which gives the sport a lot more parity. It's the reason teams like Texas, Oregon, and even 2023 Florida State were able to close the gap and become serious national championship contenders. Also, let me know in the comments, do you think that the 12 and eventually 16 team playoff is too much? Should it have stayed at 4 teams? Should it be 8 teams? Or even should we go back to the BCS? Make sure you like this video, subscribe, and again, comment your thoughts on this video. And speaking of the BCS, check out my video on the events that led to the downfall of the Bowl Championship Series.